Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gracelin Baskaran of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and our esteemed panel.
Good morning, colleagues. It's such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Gracelin Baskaran. I'm a mineral economist by training. I've spent about a decade working on critical minerals, and I am the research director for energy security and climate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I am here with an absolutely fantastic panel. Do a quick round of introductions before we get started. So to my right is Lisa Jacobson, who is the president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. She has over 20 years of experience advising federal and state policymakers on energy, tax, air quality, and climate change issues, which are all so relevant to the things we'll be talking about today. Followed by Andy Kireta, who is the president and CEO of the Copper Development Association, and as a North American regional director for the ICA. Followed by Karin. She is the chief sustainability officer at Volvo Group, and she leads the company's sustainability transition towards a fossil-free future, which is so important as we see the shift in vehicles across the world. And finally, certainly not least, we have Lawrence Dechambenoit. I'm so sorry about that. He is responsible for shaping Rio Tinto's public policy advocacy and partnerships with host countries. He's the head of external affairs. So to get going, we only have 20 minutes. That doesn't leave you for much. I actually want to get started with Lisa. So my question for you today is, how has the issue of critical minerals changed in the context of energy transition? We know that almost every country on Earth now is in a race for critical minerals, which is a big change from 5 years ago. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for moderating. It's wonderful to be with you all. I think about my work in the energy sector, primarily in the US, but we also work internationally, especially in the climate change arena. The conversation on critical minerals is top of mind to industry, of course, to all policymakers we speak with, and I think communities and stakeholders at large. We know we have to move extremely fast, especially in this decade, to address climate change. We also need to make sure that there's energy access to many people, billions of people and families throughout the world that do not have energy services yet. And critical minerals and things like copper, for example. Andy's next to me. I'm sure he'll talk more about copper. It's just essential to providing modern energy services and the economic prosperity that will come from increased energy access, and also to achieve our sustainability goals. From where I sit, critical minerals are everywhere. They are in our grid. They support electricity supply, so power generation. They are drivers of energy efficiency. They are drivers of energy storage. And we've already seen record-breaking deployment, especially in the United States, in a number of these sectors. And those records are going to continue to break year after year, which means that our global demand for critical minerals and things like copper are only going to rise. So policymakers, they understand that the energy transition is underway. They know we're in a decisive deployment decade, and they want to understand really how we can do this in an environmentally responsible way. So there are many questions. I know my organization is trying to help answer them. I know organizations like yours is too. But in real time, this is a very dynamic set of global changes, and we need to have practical solutions, and at the core of that is good information. So we are very engaged with policymakers and look forward to helping to share what our industries can about both really why we need more critical minerals and things like copper, and how we can do it in an environmentally sustainable manner. But the question isn't about whether, it's really where and how, and again, making sure that we're doing it in the most environmentally and sustainable manner.
Fantastic. I can't remember the last time that we saw something that drove so much collaborations between developed countries and emerging economies. Critical minerals are the most bipartisan issue that I can think of in modern memory. So absolutely 100% agree, and the information that we are working to build is cross-sectoral in this capacity. Andy, I kind of want to move on to you. Copper is one of the most hotly debated commodities within the list of 50 critical minerals that we have. And part of that is because we know we need it for a lot of technology. However, there's a debate on recycling, circular economy. Will those meet our needs? We know that copper is highly recyclable. Will it meet demand by 2040? And what do we need to do differently?
So Gracelin, thank you, great question. This comes up all the time when we talk about critical minerals, and everyone wants to focus on the extraction and use of the primary material, which we're definitely going to need. And it always comes up the discussion of, can't we just recycle our way to a solution? Will it get there? As Lisa said, just from the clean energy transition, the demand for critical minerals, copper, other metals to support all of those technologies is going to meet policy goals, is going to have to accelerate so rapidly that you cannot recycle your way out of this. It's got to be an all of the above approach. How do we better source responsibly primary materials like copper? How do we better bring recycled content back into the value stream and use it responsibly, sustainably, and for many lifetimes? So recycling is definitely an important part, but when you think about copper itself going from, in 2020, 25 million pounds of global use and demand to potentially 50 million tons globally in 2050, we can't get there with just recycling. Traditionally, recycled content makes up about 30% of the total worldwide demand of new copper put out in the space. And that has been very consistent, no matter what's happened in the markets, no matter what's happened with policies, it's about that 30% level. That creates a lot of opportunity, right? Is how do we get these materials back into the space, effectively process them? And so a lot of the policy around critical minerals has to actually consider those downstream pieces, not just primary. How do we enhance our recycling infrastructure? The US has been great at doing that recently, a lot of new projects on secondary processing, recovery, but we just have to get better and get more of that material back into the market. And when you think copper's a long life material, you put it in a vehicle, you put it in the electrical grid, it's going to stay there for a long time. We don't get it back immediately. So it's how do we make sure we do that at the end of life?
Those are some really interesting points, and I think we are re-architecturing the mine-to-market value chain as we've kind of long seen it. In terms of with electric vehicles and the amount of copper that's required, people don't get a new car every year in general. So I think those are some really interesting points. So we touched a lot now on the supply for copper. I'm an economist, so I look at supply and demand. So there's a lot of dynamics there, but I want to move on to Lawrence. Rio Tinto mines everywhere and they mine everything. And critical minerals, copper, but other commodities we're looking for, lithium, cobalt, most of the key minerals we're after. What would you say is the biggest constraint to increasing the supply of critical minerals and growth more broadly?
So, I mean, yes, we do mine most commodities, but not all of them. And I think the biggest constraint for us is really the social license to operate. And that's the number one constraint. It takes, on average, 10, 15 years to do exploration, which is essentially drilling holes to understand what is the ore body that we're dealing with, how we're going to mine it over time. And in order for us to be able to do that, we need to have the buy-in of the local communities and the countries in which we operate. That means that we have to have a very stable regulatory environment. We need to make sure that the permitting timelines are short enough to allow us to develop the projects in a time whereby we don't lose value of the project. I mean, if you look, for example, here in the US, it takes an average of 7 to 10 years to do permitting. In Australia, it's about 3 to 5 years, so you have to stay competitive. And then once we've gone through the exploration cycle, we need to actually design a mine, and most mines are all different. It's not like, you know, one blueprint that you come and just establish, because the rock is different, so the technology that you use for every mine is different. And once we've got that, we need to ensure that we have a sustainable way of mining, buy-in of all the local communities, and that we have thought about how the mining that we're going to do and the revenues that we're going to generate going to have a positive impact on the countries that we mine in. So the number one constraint is a social license to operate. That's really what it is. And this is why, at this point in time, while there's an increased focus on critical minerals, there's an increased focus on supply chain security, you don't have new mines being developed in the Western world. Most of the mines are developed in the global South. The dynamics are different here and in Europe. You know, you have the phenomenon of NIMBY, not in my backyard, and that's really about getting a social license. I think I'm going to be, you know, fairly honest about this. As an industry, we have done a very poor job so far at essentially branding ourselves and explaining to the broader public how our industry functions. Mostly in Europe and the US, people still think of mining as people with coal face getting into deep holes, right? And the analogy I use is 20 years ago, we used to pick up a phone that was plugged into a wall and dial into it. Today, we have a cell phone that you can fit in a pocket. So you should imagine that the technology of mining has evolved in the same way, right? Our mines are much cleaner. We don't dig deep holes anymore. We do a lot of block caving, so we refill the holes. Our sustainability thresholds are much higher. We try to restore the environment to the way that we found it when we first started mining. So we've got to essentially shift the mindset around what mining looks like.
Fantastic. Social license to operate is absolutely one of those issues in the last 5 to 7 years where we've seen it go from like a nice to have to something that has to be a core part of the business model. And I think you're absolutely right, is that we always joke that oil and gas has long been very strategic about their engagement with policymakers, but it's relatively new on the mining front. I've watched in Washington, D.C. as mining companies have really shored up their presence in the last couple of years, which is really reflective of the sector's urgency to engage on that policy level in a way that they have not and often been in that periphery. Now, social license to operate brings us to a very fascinating topic, Karin, that I want to ask you about, is responsible mining. The conversation keeps coming back to that. We see at mining forums globally that it's like we need to get the ESG, we need to be responsible, especially connecting to the point that the majority of new mines are in emerging economies where countries, they may not have the same standards on some of these issues. What challenges to responsible mining do we face, particularly in the critical mineral space, and what can we do about it?
Thank you. I think let me start and share a little bit about the perspective from an OEM. So Volvo Group has as an ambition to become net zero by 2040. And to do that, the most important thing is really to electrify our products, trucks, construction equipment, buses, etc. And one of the enablers to electrify is, of course, critical minerals. So the demand for critical minerals for us will definitely increase in the years to come. That, of course, means quite some challenges because already today they are scarce in supply, so it might mean increased costs for us, but there are also, as you're pointing to, both social and more of environmental issues with that. So I think we are trying to tackle this question in 3 different ways. First of all, we try to use as little as possible, of course. and that can be done in different ways, but we also are looking into recyclability of batteries, etc. So that's one way we can deal with it. The other way we can deal with it is, as an OEM, we can do responsible sourcing in different ways. So we have dedicated sustainable minerals programs. We are also a member of the Responsible Mineral Initiative, so that we make sure that whatever we source is done in a responsible way, and we can put some pressure on that. Last thing I wanted to mention, and that's coming back to your discussion about the cell phone, that of course mining can be done in a more sustainable way. And here we are developing different types of solutions, both electrified solutions, both for trucks and construction equipment machines, but also autonomous solutions. And here we are happy to say that we have a collaboration together with Rio Tinto to be able to contribute to a more sustainable mining that we think can make sure that we have both less emissions, we have higher productivity, but also more safety in the mines.
Thank you. So we have just enough time that I want to do a quick, 45-second round of questions for each of you. Similar question. Lisa, you have decades of experience working with governments and on the policy front. So my question for you would be, what can the government do to strengthen collaboration with the private sector on critical minerals? Because it can't be an effort on just one side or the other. Andy, one of the things I want to ask you next, just they have more notice than you do, apologies, and is, recycling is this huge government priority right now, acknowledging that we're not going to meet the demand that we need. Is there any way the government can support recycling efforts going forward? Karin, I wanted to ask you, what ways, again, similar to the question with Lisa, how can the government work with auto manufacturers? We often talk about the extraction point, but when we work further along the value chain, are there any areas for support? And Lawrence, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the regulatory environment abroad, every country is very different. Is there a way that the US government can support a uniform approach on standards, social license to operate? Is there any scope for that public-private collaboration?
Well, very briefly, I want to touch on a point that Lawrence made. I think the biggest thing that policymakers can do, number one, is to look at our regulatory structures across many parts of the energy transition and achieving net zero goals. We need to move very quickly, which means that our permitting, siting, regulatory processes need to protect our environment and society, but also be on track to enable us to build and to modernize. We have so much opportunity, we have many technologies to deploy, and we've got to be able to keep pace with that when it comes to our regulations. So big pin on that. I also think just conversations like this, as it was one of the panelists mentioned, we really haven't been coming together in this way as different segments of the economy and talking about the strong demand for critical minerals and copper, and that we all want to come together to collaborate for solutions.
You only have 45 seconds to me, so the answer is yes. No.
Well, you have 20 now, so.
There's a lot of policy space out there to really make a difference in terms of recycling across all of the critical minerals and materials. And really the opportunity is to create a priority for end-of-life collection and how we do that in countries, because most of these industries are very good at recapturing new scrap, primary scrap that's coming out in the manufacturing process between OEMs and producers. It's really once it goes into the urban mine or the use phase that getting it back at the end of that life is really the challenge. And I think it's really a matter of creating policies that create that priority.
Fantastic.
I would say that something that we are lacking today is really transparency throughout the value chain, and I think it's not only us, it's everyone. So anything that governments and policymakers can do to enable that collaboration between companies, between suppliers, in order to increase transparency would be very welcomed by us.
I think the main thing the US government can do is be a convener. I mean, the US itself has its own challenges in terms of permitting reform, but I think being a convener of various bodies in order to have sharing of information and thinking about ESG standards, transparency in the value chain, transparency in the use of revenues from mining is something that's critical.
Fantastic. These are some wonderful insights on how the public and private sector can work together. It's such an urgent race to critical minerals, and I look forward to seeing the role we all play in that going forward. Thank you.